Hey folks, Mr. Howard here. I'm here to start a video lecture series on The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Um, hopefully you're tuning in and you're enjoying it. I'm going to post sequentially a bunch of lectures. We'll go through chapter by chapter. We'll look at the story. We'll do a read aloud, and I'll try and give you analysis as I read aloud through the book. And hopefully that can supplement your education now that you're all sort of quarantined and trapped at home. For the moment. There's going to be no assignments with this. It's just watch and enjoy and learn if you want to. Certainly no pressure, and hopefully you do and you enjoy it. And hopefully, you miss education. I know I do. This is my new normal is being at home. And as much as I love my family, there's an element of me, like I'm a teacher. I like teaching. I like educating. And I miss being in the classroom and seeing everybody's face. And so this is an avenue for me to attain some level of normalcy in my own life, and hopefully for you to do the same. So let's start out with some sort of background information. First things first, I put a sheet up on the webpage with some themes and useful stuff to help you out. You can download that and look at that if you want. Also, I'll put a link on the class page to the full text of The Picture of Dorian Gray. If you can't get that, though, it's really easy. It predates copyright, so all you have to do is open up Google and type in Picture of Dorian Gray full text, and a whole bunch of them are going to populate your field, and you can pick which one you want. To those of you who's turned in your books as annotations, I have them. I've graded them, but no, you don't have your book back. So those of you that read this for your outside reading project, hopefully there's stuff in here that you didn't think about and that will help you understand the book more, but I apologize that I have your books and you can't read along at home in them. I'm sorry. But certainly the text is available, and I recommend to anybody to download the text and to have it open on the device while you're watching on a different device. We'll see if that works. If not, you're going to hear the whole story anyway with my little bits of analysis here and there, and hopefully that will help you. So let's start out with some background information and useful stuff like that. First thing I'd recommend that you do, if you don't know who Oscar Wilde is, if you can't remember from class or you never looked it up before, go on Wikipedia and look up Oscar Wilde. He's a really, really interesting guy, and you'll find out lots of useful information about him that will help you understand the book. First off, this is the only novel that he ever published. Everything else that he published is plays, which will help you understand that the structure of the novel itself is very dialogue heavy. It's a novel that is entirely full of dialogue, which sort of shows you Oscar Wilde's playwriting predilection behind the way that he structured this. It's almost like a play into which he inserted a narrator to help carry the action along. The narrator's secondary to the dialogue, which is primary. You don't get that a whole lot. Obviously, you get it in drama. Shakespeare's really big with dialogue. There's a few other authors that are really dialogue heavy like this and do an excellent job. Jane Austen comes to mind immediately if you've read Pride and Prejudice and some of those. So it's going to be a dialogue heavy work, and that has to do with Oscar Wilde's background as a playwright. Other things that maybe you should know about Oscar Wilde: he came from Ireland. I think his dad is a foot doctor, and his mom ran a salon. Which a salon it's a restaurant that at the time, it's not a hairdresser. That's a modern interpretation. Back then, a salon was a restaurant where people went to talk about politics and art, generally in sort of a liberal way. They weren't conservative salons; they were liberal salons. And so he would have grown up around thinkers and politicians and writers, and it would have infused his everyday atmosphere. So I think that's something that helps you understand him. He went on scholarship to Oxford, so he's an Oxonian. He graduated from Oxford. The other really important piece of information is that Oscar Wilde was almost certainly homosexual. And you can go and you can look up that information. He was married. He did have a family. But he went on trial essentially for homosexuality, and the Victorians were really big on writing everything down, and homosexuality was a crime at the time. So you can go and you can read all the excerpts from the trial and all of that kind of stuff. I'm not going to get into all of that, but he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to work camp, I think for 2 years. He went to Reading Jail, wrote a poem about it. I highly recommend his poem about Reading Jail. It's incredible stuff. Came out, and his family had left him, and he moved to France, and he died. It sort of wrecked him. He died shortly thereafter. with, of course, his famous last words. I think I told this to the class already, but it's funny enough to say again. Turns out that Oscar Wilde was dying in Paris, and he was in a hotel, and apparently he really, really hated the wallpaper in the hotel room, and had asked to have it changed a number of times. And he waited until he was like right about to pass out, at which point, like, he sat up in the bed and he stared at the guy who was in the room with him, and he was like, "Either that wallpaper goes, or I do." And then he died. Which is, it's hilarious. But anyway, there's a lot of great information on Oscar Wilde, and even though Oscar Wilde tells you in the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray that art is not a form of autobiography, I humbly disagree. I think that all art is autobiography. All authors write about their lives and their experience in their works, and understanding who the author is and what their life was like helps you understand the work itself. So take 10 minutes and read the Wikipedia page. You'll find yourself better prepared to understand the novel. So that's number one. Let's talk about the setting. This story is set in Victorian England. Some things you should know about Victorian England. Obviously, this is England after the Industrial Revolution, after the Napoleonic Wars. People wearing top hats. There's giant smokestacks shooting out smog. We got railroads that are going all over the country. It's a very metropolitan place. England was the center of a giant empire, the biggest empire in the world. They referred to it as the British Peace, the Pax Romana that surrounded the entire world. I think it was Kipling, I can't remember 100%, but some famous author in the Victorian age coined that phrase that you probably heard before, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And if you take a quick second to think about how much England owned at the time, it's sort of stunning. You can go from, the United Kingdom itself, England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland. But then you can look at, like, Canada. Okay, that's cool. Jamaica, all right. South Africa, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, India, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong. Like, you could just keep going. They own pretty much the entire world, and the mercantile system, you may remember from history class, brought them an enormous amount of wealth that was churning through their factories all the time. And so this little tiny island was sort of a hub for a lot of internationalism and imperialism. And so, I think that's something to think about in the situation with the novel itself. I think Oscar Wilde is one of those writers who's sort of opposite of Kipling. He's more about the decadence of the British Empire in the Victorian age. And, that's sort of a minor theme. You can sort of see the attitude of the rich and the wealthy, and that play out throughout the story itself. So that's a setting, London, the center of the world, and that's important. Let's see. And that social commentary that Wilde puts in so many of his books, the idea of decadence and the wastefulness and apathy and, all of this kind of stuff of the upper class British life, that's front and center in this novel. Almost all of his plays, they were written for the upper class, and so they're about the upper class, and they're about upper class issues. They're the people that went to the plays for the most part, and his novel follows suit entirely. And you can if you've read The Importance of Being Earnest or Lady Windermere's Fan or any of his other famous plays, you'll see a lot of the same themes, some of the same characters. He even borrows phrases from himself. When he says something perfectly, you can just sort of feel him be like, aha, that was perfectly said. And they'll take it and they'll put it in another book or another work somewhere. And so you'll get some of the same phrases. And some of the characters are very similar. Like Lord Henry is very much like Algernon from The Importance of Being Earnest, except that he's sort of like an evil, satanic Algernon. So if you took Algernon from The Importance of Being Earnest and you combined him with Iago from Othello, that's sort of your antagonist, Lord Henry, from The Picture of Dorian Gray. Let's talk about some other quick things, and then we'll call this video done and move on to talking about themes and stuff in another video. So let's talk about your narrative point of view. In The Picture of Dorian Gray, your narrator is a third-person omniscient narrator, sort of a voice of God. He knows everything about everybody. You switch point of views between characters sort of seamlessly. You sort of follow the big three primarily. Your big three characters are Lord Henry Wotton, Basil Hallward, and Dorian Gray. More on them in a second. And the book, again, has a focus on dialogue. The story structure itself, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's a 20-chapter book. The first 10 chapters are sort of the story of Dorian Gray's youth. And then you get chapter 11, which is this giant montage chapter that goes through a number of years of Dorian Gray's life. And it's actually, it seems kind of like a dull chapter, but when you go through it, which we will, you start to see how everything about the chapter is thematic and symbolic and sort of connects the two parts together. And so that's a chapter that we want to dig into. And then chapters 12 to 20 are sort of the story of Dorian Gray's age. And so you have these two sort of juxtaposing sections that tell you different things about Dorian and his development as a character. He's obviously a dynamic character, and the change that he goes through is the central focus of the entire book, which interestingly was blamed for being an immoral book during its time period, but is kind of a supremely moral book when you actually look at the characters and what's going on. Speaking of characters, let's move on with that. In order of appearance, the big three characters are Lord Henry Wotton, Basil Hallward, and Dorian Gray. So Lord Henry is your antagonist. He's not an incredibly active antagonist. He does almost all of his antagonizing verbally through words. And he's sort of about the power of words and the power of influence. The power of art to influence people. There's lots of stuff that Oscar Wilde's doing here. But he's your antagonist. He's the second son of an English lord, which means he's not going to inherit anything because his older brother Dartmoor is going to inherit everything. And he's kind of bitter about that. And you see that in England, especially with rich families, the eldest son inherited everything because that's how you kept the family fortune together, which means the younger son, he's in debt, he's living off credit. His older brother is paying his bills, but he really doesn't have a job. He doesn't do anything. He sits around and is a lord or a lordling or whatever you want to call him. And so there's some really important allegorical things going on with Lord Henry. Like I said, he's the antagonist. He does almost all of his antagonism through words and influence. You may have guessed he's a Satan figure in the story, so you want to look at him and think about him as the whole story could be an allegory with the Garden of Eden and with Lord Henry as Satan. So you want to look at him and think about that as you go through. If you've read a lot of British literature, there's a lot of connections between him and Iago from Othello and him and Satan from Paradise Lost, and a lot of things that you can look at and be impressed by. But yeah, he's also, I think, a symbol for Hellenism. So another one of the themes, which we'll talk about in my next recording, is this contrast between Hellenism, in other words, the ancient Greek world, and medievalism, sort of the medieval world, and how the Victorian society is looking back on the Greek world and trying to emulate a lot of Greek behaviors, but they're also heavily influenced by the medieval times that came before. And, if you look at art in the Victorian period especially, you see these two major influences, the Greeks and the medievalists. There are these pre-Raphaelite painters who are producing medieval works, and medieval times had this huge resurgence. Lots of medieval novels and medieval settings, and you sort of see it even in the Gothic settings of so many Victorian novels. The Middle Ages were huge, and they were romanticized, and they were seen in this very, very powerful way. But on the flip side, so was, Greek society. When you look at like Athens and democracy and logic and, stuff like that. And so when you look at Lord Henry, you're going to see a lot of sort of Greek and Athenian qualities in him, and that's something you want to pay attention to. Finally, there's another conflict, sort of a duality in the story, and that's a duality between realism and romanticism. And Lord Henry, I'm going to say, represents realism, seeing things for what they are, valuing the surface for the surface, not trying to look at the symbol, not trying to understand things in more depth. That's his philosophy on art, which matches with Oscar Wilde's. He believed in the power of art, but he was a aesthetic, which meant he liked art for art's sake. It didn't have to have a symbolic meaning to be worthwhile or useful. So Lord Henry is sort of a window for realism as well. The character directly opposing Lord Henry is this guy named Basil Hallward. He's a painter, a really talented painter. He's the guy who paints the picture of Dorian Gray. Footnote: this guy on the cover of the book is not Dorian Gray. There is no picture of Dorian Gray. This picture is a picture of Franz Liszt, who is a famous composer. I think he's Austrian. Pianist, mostly, and composer. So you can look up Franz Liszt stuff on YouTube and listen to him while you read, I guess. You can have the full picture. So moving on from there, Basil Hallward's an interesting character because